Great friends, and welcome to the Wednesday, January 25th edition. We are so glad that you've joined us again with Steve Autrey, Paul Thompson. And today we make a shift as we start looking forward to Sunday. Last week we talked about the kingdom of heaven. I hope Sunday was a good day, and I hope that you heard some conversation that was interesting for you around the kingdom of heaven. But today we move along into the Gospel of Matthew, and we talk about the call that Jesus places on the disciples. And certainly there's a lot of fodder, Steve, for us to grapple with and think about in our own lives, about our own sense of calling, about the call of the disciples, and what does it mean to be called by God?
Yeah, those are all really big questions. And it's been we both been in ministry for a while now, and I was thinking the other day how easy it is to get away from that initial call, the initial pull into ministry that only God can provide. And so it's helpful to revisit that.
Yeah, one of the things that I did a little session with our Tuesday morning men's Bible study a week or so ago on baptism. And one of the things I said at the end, and it comes from a reference in 1 Peter, this whole idea of priesthood of believers, is the idea that each person in your baptism, it is a call to ministry. And I think sometimes we think only, pastor types can be called, or certain lay people who have a special role in the life of the church. And they may have a call into that, but the sense of calling is core to
everybody. And would you want just people like me and Paul being in charge of this whole endeavor? It wouldn't work out very well.
Not very well at all.
Which gets to this point that Jesus begins with people. He doesn't begin with a business plan. He doesn't begin with investors. He doesn't
build a church.
Doesn't start with a building. He starts by reaching out to people right where they are, not people who he doesn't
have a nice resume.
Has a resume who had any biblical training. Mm-mm. He doesn't make his way down to the temple and find the students of the most learned rabbis and Pharisees. He simply starts where he is, which we know is in Capernaum. And who does he find there?
Yeah, he finds these fishermen who, probably blue collar, we might call these guys, not educated, maybe not even very sophisticated.
Yeah, and that's hard exactly to know, right? They would have been raised in the way of Moses. They would have had understanding of their faith and religion. But they did not think about what it took to make a living in the first century. It would mean that you are up at the crack of dawn. You are working, and these fishermen even worked into the night. You didn't have the kind of leisure time to devote to reading something just because you wanted to.
If anybody's ever owned a business, it's
or worked on a farm, right?
It is all consuming, and even when you're not tending animals or fishing, you're mending nets, you're making the boat, you're making the connections,
and
you're selling it.
Just the effort it would take to make sure you had water in your house for that day. All the things that we take for granted we have all these things that we say are time savers, but yet we seem to have no time. Well, in the first century, they literally had no time. It was either you were working or you were sleeping, or on the Sabbath, you were resting. And that was the rhythm of their life. So it's not like they got home in the evening and cut on the local news or watched a podcast. Just to even get light in your house meant an extreme expense.
So if any of us were going to go about and we're going to start a movement. We're going to start, this kingdom of heaven. We're going to initiate this. Where would we begin? And Steve mentioned a business plan or a business model. It's fascinating where Jesus begins with that. He doesn't create a building so that he can invite people to. Mm-hmm. He doesn't create a structure around which, you'll be the new vice president, you'll be an investor, any of this. He simply walks around and he sees people where they are, and he says, hey, come walk with me.
Yeah, and that's what's fascinating too. He doesn't say believe in me.
Doesn't say believe. Doesn't say worship
Doesn't
me.
say worship me. Make a confession of faith. He doesn't even initially. We don't see. He doesn't baptize them.
Mm-mm.
He just says follow me, and I think that's more than just tag along. Right? It's more than it's emulate what I'm doing. It's pay attention and model your life on what I am.
It's not just hang out with me and hope that something rubs off on that. It's a very much an apprentice model in which he says, okay, you come, you journey with me, you observe what I do. I want to invite you to do some of those same things. You remember a few years ago when we had the guy, Brian Zaire, who came along and taught us about, how do you go about doing an apprentice model in a church? And it's very much, okay, you watch me, then you're going to do it, and I'll watch you doing it. And then after a couple of 3-4 times, then you do it, and I'll just sit back and watch.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's this would have been much more natural in the first century where you had to apprentice. You usually stayed within, that's why people stayed in the fields they were born into almost always. It's why the blacksmith's son usually became the next blacksmith, because he would have tagged along with dad to work and just become part of it. I know this man here knows how to take care of cows.
I sure do. I watched my dad and walked along with him and watched how he interacted with them, and so I know cows.
I know how to dig shrubbery. It's interesting that I don't even remember when I learned exactly how to do that, but it's just part of what you learn to do when you grow up and your dad's a shrubbery farmer. I'm always, occasionally I've seen people trying to dig a plant, and I'm like, they don't have a clue what they're doing because, they've never learned. And it's a similar thing, that it just becomes part of who you are because that's what you see and that's what you know. But this is a huge change for these men who've been used to doing, at least initially, the folks that he calls are used to doing hard physical labor. Fishing, we think of fishing as a something to do as a hobby.
Yeah,
right? You get out on Lake Norman, catch a few bass, but they're doing everything they can to pull in fish out of the Sea of Galilee to feed their families.
If they don't fish, their families don't eat.
And it wouldn't have been easy. There are no motorized lifts. It's throw that net in the water and haul in what you get.
Yeah, there's no way to find out if there's
outboard
radar where the fish are.
No outboard motors. If you want to get to a certain part of the lake, you pick up the oars and you row. And for them to shift to being students, it's a big shift for them. But it's also something they readily do when we read the Gospels. And tomorrow I'd like to talk a little bit more about what must that have been like to hear this call and to make this radical change in your life orientation to follow
it's
a
not
teacher.
Exactly that we're told. Did they have any interaction with Jesus before this?
We don't know this.
Did we know? Have we thought that they've been hearing stories about this guy and recognized him from when they saw and heard him? If you simply read, which we'll do tomorrow, simply read the story, it's as if this is a chance encounter. Jesus says, "Hey, follow me." We really don't know.
We don't know
if there's any action before that.
So we'll talk a little bit about that tomorrow. Look forward to seeing you then.
Thank you for joining us.